In this tutorial, we will talk about Screen Wake Lock API. Let's talk about Screen Wake Lock API. So the Screen Wake Lock API prevents the screen from turning off, dimming, or locking. In many cases, we have seen that desktops or laptops by default turn off their screen after a specified amount of time. And this is done to prolong the life of the hardware or save on the battery power. But in some cases, we need the screen to stay awake, such as when the user is reading an ebook, or if the user is following a recipe, or when the user is presenting to an audience. So in these cases, we can use Screen Wake Lock API. And the usage of Screen Wake Lock API is very simple. We need to acquire a wake lock and it will prevent the screen from turning off or dimming as long as the web page is visible in the browser. And this is because only visible documents or visible HTML pages can acquire the Screen Wake Lock. One important thing to note here is that we may not be able to acquire a lock if the machine is in power save mode, or if the machine has low battery, or if the web page or document is not visible in the browser itself. Now that we know the basics, let's implement this by writing a web page and some JavaScript code. So I have created a simple HTML page. It has two buttons. Upon clicking of this button, we want to acquire a Screen Wake API lock, and upon clicking of this release lock button, we want to release the Wake API lock. So let's write the JavaScript code. So I will create a script tag here, and I will first create a wake lock variable. And we will use this variable later, but the first step is to let's create these methods, acquire lock and release lock. So function acquire lock and function release lock. So we have created these two functions here, and I will write to do acquire lock here, to do release lock here, because here we want to release the lock. Now before we use these two functions, we want to first check whether the wake lock API is supported by the browser or not. And this is because since the wake lock API is still in working draft, it may not be fully supported by all the browsers. So we can write if wake lock in navigator, and if the wake lock is in navigator, it means that the wake lock is supported. Wake lock is supported, else it is not supported. So here what I want to do is I want to disable these two buttons, because if the lock is not supported, we should disable both these buttons. So let's do it. Document.get element by ID, and then acquire lock dot disabled is equal to true, and release lock is also disabled. Now we will be disabling and enabling these buttons at multiple places. So I'm going to write a function here, function toggle buttons, and acquire lock and release lock. And I am just going to copy and paste this line here, and I can use these two variables in here. And instead of this, I can simply do toggle buttons and true, true. And this means that we want to disable both these buttons. Instead of toggle, we can use disable buttons because that makes more sense here. So disable buttons. If the wake lock API is supported, I have created a paragraph tag here. So I want to write it down on my web page that the document wake lock API is supported. So document.get element by ID and wake lock API label dot inner text is equal to wake lock is supported. And I can copy and paste this line here and say wake lock is not supported. Now when the script is loaded, this block of code will run first, and if the wake lock is not supported, it's gonna disable these two buttons and it will show us that the wake lock is not supported. Now let's implement this acquire lock. So we have created this wake lock variable here, and I am going to use this variable here in the acquire lock function. So I'm going to use acquire lock is equal to navigator dot wake lock dot request, and this request method means that we want to acquire a wake lock, and I'm going to pass screen here, and this screen means that I want to acquire a screen wake lock. This would return me a promise, so I am just going to call await here because I want my promise to be settled, and that's why I've put await here. And we cannot use await without async, so I'm going to put async here. Now, if the wake lock is acquired, then I am going to call disable button because we have already acquired the lock. I want to disable the release button. Sorry, I want to disable the acquire button because we have already acquired the lock, and we don't want to disable the release lock because if a lock is acquired, we can release it by clicking on this release button. So now let's give an alert as well. So alert wake lock is acquired. And the wake lock can only be acquired or can remain acquired if the web page is visible in the browser. So if we open a different tab in the browser, the wake lock would be released by the browser itself. So let's add an event listener here. So add event listener, and it is going to listen to release event. So release, then I'm going to invoke a method here, a function here, and this function I'm creating it with arrow functions here. So if the lock is released, I want to re-enable the acquire button. So here I'm just going to say true and this would be false. Okay, this would be false. True. This would be true and this would be false. So we have created an event listener here, and let's put this in the console too so that we can see when we switch the tabs. Week log is released. Now this portion is complete. Let's write the release log function. So we can say wake log dot release, and this means that if the wake log is released, then I want to invoke a function, and here I am going to re-enable the acquire button and disable the release button. And I'm going to write console.log wake log released. So if the user clicks on this release lock button, it's going to invoke this release lock function, and this will invoke release method on the wake lock object. And if we get a successful response, then we will disable the buttons and print it on the console. Let's just do alert in case so that we can see it. So the code looks complete. Let's try to open this HTML file in the browser and see how it behaves. Okay, so I'm going to open the HTML file. So here we can see that wake lock is supported. This means that this browser supports the wake lock API. Now let's click on acquire lock, and this should acquire the wake lock. And we get an alert that wake lock is acquired. So if the wake lock is acquired, the machine will not go into power save mode, or the machine will not turn off this screen. Now let's release it. If I release the wake lock, then it means that the screen can dim. And let's try to open another browser, another tab, and let's open developer console so that we can see. Now I have opened the console. Now let me acquire the lock again. So now the wake lock is acquired, and if I go to this tab, it should release the lock. So I am in this tab now, and if I go back, I can see here that the wake lock is released and the release lock button is disabled. When I created this tutorial, the screen wake lock API was still in working draft, and this means that the specification can change from time to time. So if you are interested in working with screen wake lock API, it is always a good idea to check the GitHub link and see what changes and what improvements are being made. So through the demo, we have learned the steps to acquire and release the screen wake lock. If you are interested in reading more about it, you can go to this URL and read the latest documentation. And in the next video in this API tutorial series, we will learn a new API.